As President of the United States, I know that for most of human history, power has not been unipolar. And the end of the Cold War may have led too many to forget this truth. I've noticed as president that at times both America's adversaries and some of our allies believe that all problems were either caused by Washington or could be solved by Washington. And perhaps too many in Washington believe that as well. Yes, in America, there is too much money in politics, too much entrenched partisanship, too little participation by citizens, in part because of a patchwork of laws that makes it harder to vote. Too often in capitals, decision makers have forgotten that democracy needs to be driven by civic engagement from the bottom up, not governance by experts from the top down.
I know it. Is that true? Let me see.
Let me show you the two that are for you.
You're doing it. No problem.
Win, I think.
Early.
Now I am going to second point. As minister, governor, high-ranking peoples, and the people of the country, they must love their leader. This is the point number one. If you go to any country, you will find that everybody must love his leader. They must love their ministers. They must love their governors. They must love their district commissioners, their teachers, their chiefs. Everybody must be loved. It is an education to the people. This is the duty of the minister. If I see the minister is a coward, automatically I kick you out of my office. Because I know that you have got something wrong with you. I will put another person straight. Or any governor or anybody. This I must make it absolutely clear. And even whether you hide, you will be known in a light completely. This I must make it absolutely clear. Whether you hide, you go where, you will be known completely. But this particular second point is very important. You must teach people to love their leader. This is the only most important, like any country.
We live in an interesting time in human history, perhaps a unique moment even. On one hand, there seems to be a lot of distrust of politicians today, 8 years after the 2008 stock market crash and the economic malaise that's followed for most people. You can see this in the Brexit vote that hit England this summer, and in this election season in the United States. But on closer inspection, things are not what they seem on the surface. Yes, people are frustrated with their elected leaders, actually angry in a lot of cases. But I want to show you why, actually, never before in human history has so much faith been placed by a people on their rulers than in this moment, despite the anger you see. People still have absolute faith. You see, the real decisions when it comes to the economy today are not decided on by voters in elections, but by bureaucrats at central banks and inside institutions like the IMF, the US Treasury Department, and the European Union. And the action of the past few years in the financial markets themselves show that investors have absolute confidence that these rulers can control markets for them forever. After several years of stock market gains, stock market investors have come to have total faith that the markets can be controlled for them by their rulers. As evidence of this, stock market valuations have gone to levels only seen 3 times before in the history of the United States. This chart is of the cyclically adjusted P/E ratio for the S&P 500. Roughly 16 months ago, it reached a level only seen before in 1929, 1999, and in 2007. Those 3 times occurred at major stock market peaks when people thought that the stock market could never drop again. Now, there was a manic faith in Alan Greenspan, who headed the Federal Reserve in 1999 before that internet bust hit the financial markets. But a same manic faith in Ben Bernanke also took hold after the 2008 crisis. And this time, valuations have managed to stay high for not just a few months, but for almost 2 years now. And so today, people on CNBC have been arguing for about a year that stock market valuations no longer matter, that stock market cycles have actually been abolished because they say that the Federal Reserve can keep interest rates at 0 practically forever, indefinitely. They say if you cannot get interest at the bank, that makes stocks that pay any dividend worth any price that you can pay to get them. Built into this is an assumption that conditions today will not change, but all markets move in cycles, and we are at a valuation peak in the financial markets actually never before seen in history if you look beyond stocks. Take a look at this chart. What we have seen this year are the lowest interest rates on government debt in the entire history of government debt and the entire history of mankind. What we have seen are negative interest rates in European bonds and Japanese bonds that have driven the global interest rates for government debt down and U.S. Treasury bond interest rates down to record lows. Now, you need to understand why this is actually crazy. When you buy a bond, you get interest for that bond as long as you hold it. But if you buy a bond bearing a negative interest rate, what that means is you must pay the government money for holding that bond. In other words, you're guaranteed to lose money on the investment. That has never before happened in human history in the government debt markets. Why would anyone make an investment like that? That's the question you got to ask. Well, when interest rates go down in value, as they've done, bonds actually go up in value. So Treasury bonds have been in an almost 26-year bull market that people have seen year after year after year. They can't remember a big bear market in them, and they just seem to assume that this bull market will never end. So the people buying these bonds simply believe that central banks are going to keep making the bonds go up even more, even if they make no sense anymore from an investment standpoint. This is a crazy bubble. This is the biggest bubble ever, really, in human history. Bigger than the internet stock bubble in 1999. And just like the internet stocks back then, when people said that you could value companies on website page views instead of revenue, from a fundamental basis, the investments make no sense. But look at this. This is the PE ratio for the German government bonds, which shows you the price you're paying for the earnings you'll get by buying the bonds. The ratio, as you can see, went off the charts once the yields went negative. Buying this as an investment to hold and make money on is simply insane. But that is where the bonds have gone, and one day they'll eventually go into a real bear market and destroy the people buying these negative interest rate yielding bonds today and trying to hold them. But what this really is showing you is the total confidence in the Federal Reserve and other central banks to control the markets that these bond buyers now have. You see, they think that these bonds can pay off by going up even more. And for that to happen, they assume that somehow interest rates are going to go even more negative in Europe and in Japan. It shows that people really do believe right now in the financial markets that the central banks can essentially control everything the way they want to forever. Now, it's true that the low interest rates have indeed pushed the stock market up too, to its high valuation levels. In fact, there's lots of people on the internet that say that the Federal Reserve has actually made the stock market go up by buying stocks themselves. But there's no evidence for that. I don't believe it. And in fact, it's really not what they've done. And you need to know actually what they have done for real to understand what their influence has been, how they've done this, and what's eventually going to happen in the stock market and the economy itself. Now, in 2008, the Federal Reserve lowered rates to zero in response to the housing bubble bust in the United States that hurt the mortgage markets, hurt the balance sheets of Wall Street banks. And so the government began to bail these Wall Street banks out, with the Federal Reserve leading the charge by printing money to buy their worthless mortgages from them. They then engaged in more bond buying programs over the years they called quantitative easing, something they'd never done before. Now, much of this was done to finance the U.S. federal government budget deficit, because that deficit totally exploded. And in fact, it went up so high that there are no longer enough people in the world to buy the bonds to finance it. The people at the Fed wanted to bridge that gap and keep interest rates low, so they began to buy Treasury bonds themselves. And they gave this a fancy name. They called it quantitative easing. One side effect of this program, though, was it distorted the debt markets outside of the Treasury bond market. It made it so you could no longer go to the bank and make any money on interest. You can no longer deposit money in the bank and get any sort of return that was meaningful. And you couldn't buy CDs that could make you anything. And Wall Street money managers, institutional investors, and big money guys that need to make interest with a percentage of their money, they had to find ways to do it. And when the Fed made the rates of interest low on Treasury bonds and bank deposits, where they could no longer make money off interest, they went into more risky debt instruments. They went into junk bonds. Junk bonds. Junk bonds are bonds issued by corporations to borrow money from investors, and the junk bond market totally exploded starting in 2012 because of the low interest rates the Fed created in the debt markets. You see, when the government debt interest rates went to historic lows, so did those of junk bonds. And the companies took advantage of those record low rates to borrow money at record levels. And sometimes they use that money to expand, to build things, to build new factories, hotels, construction, and so forth. But because of a lack of a real economic recovery since 2008, the bulk of that borrowed money went into something non-productive. It went into stock market share buybacks. What the companies did was they issued junk bonds and then used that money to buy back their own stock shares from the stock market. This had the effect of reducing the number of shares outstanding so that the companies could say that their earnings per share were growing even when their revenues were often in decline. And Wall Street analysts and people on CNBC would report those earnings as if they were growing for real and tell you to buy the stocks. And many people saw the stocks go up, and the higher they went up, the more they wanted to buy them. As the Harvard Business Review, though, put it, what this has been profits without prosperity. But it all seemed to make sense to people in the stock market who really didn't want to think about things too deeply. They just wanted to buy and see things go up and make money. And because the stocks were going up, they were happy. But a funny thing has been happening. Look at these charts. This is from expert Ed Yardeni's report, and it shows you the money flows into and out of the stock market. Institutional investors, whether they be mutual funds, hedge funds, or endowments and pension funds, they've actually, as a whole, as an aggregate, have been taking more money out of the stock market than they have been putting into it. One of the reasons why is because small investors that own these funds, they need the money. They need the money to live off of as they retire and they get older. The younger generation doesn't have the income to put the money into the market to replace that money coming out from the older generation. But a big, huge factor is simply that the economy's weak. People need this money just to live and to survive in so many cases. But this is also happening with foreign investors outside the United States. They're taking money out of their stock markets and they're taking money out of the markets of the United States, more than they're putting into it. And that leads to a major, major question. If that's the case, then how's the stock market been going up since 2009 so much? How's it been able to stay at these high levels too without going into a decline yet? Where's the buying been coming from? Well, it's been coming from the corporate share buyback programs that have been fueled by the issuance of junk bond debt, which have been enabled by the Federal Reserve's policies and other central banks' policies all over the world of keeping interest rates as low as possible through bond buying programs, through quantitative easing, even if they generate negative interest rates, which make no rational, fundamental sense, and have taken the bond markets all over the world to valuations never before seen in world history. That's the moment we're in, and it's wild. And it shows you that even though large segments of the population are angry at the politicians, they distrust the politicians, in reality, the people that own money all over the world in the financial markets actually have complete trust, complete faith in the rulers of the financial markets, or the people they think are in control of the financial markets, the central bankers. They actually, in this moment in history, if you judge by the price they're willing to buy government debt, have more faith in their rulers than has ever been seen before. So we're in a manic moment in human history. The question is, how long can it go on for? And what is the end game going to be? This is a global debt situation impacting the entire world and central bank rulers everywhere. The central bankers know the financial situation is reaching an end game. All they have left to do now is hope that what they have done leads to something good. Because the global debts are so big now that the only good outcome is if somehow economic growth all over the world starts to pick up finally and explodes quickly, upwards soon, and then the world grows out of these debts before they become a real serious problem. So right now, they have nothing left to do but just party and get drunk and hope for the best. Of course, these central bank policies have benefited those that own stocks in the stock market the most in the United States. And it is at this moment in time that these stock market investors have come to have absolute faith in their rulers and trust them no matter what the long-term costs of their policies to the country and the world may be.
In terms of income, 95% of new income generated in this country in the last year went to the top 1%. Now, a study which I've just introduced into the record by two professors from Princeton University, Professor Martin Gillens, and Northwestern University Professor Benjamin Page, basically suggests that while historically we have considered our society to be a capitalist democracy, we may now have entered into a phase where we are an oligarchic form of society. In your judgment, given the enormous power held by the billionaire class and their political representatives, are we still a capitalist democracy, or have we gone over into an oligarchic form of society in which incredible economic and political power now rests with the billionaire class?
So all of the statistics on inequality that you've cited are ones that greatly concern me. And I think for the same reason that you're concerned about them, they can shape determine the ability of different groups to participate equally in a democracy and have grave effects on social stability over time.
Human beings are too often motivated by greed and by power. Big countries, for most of history, have pushed smaller ones around. Tribes and ethnic groups and nation states have very often found it most convenient to define themselves by what they hate and not just those ideas that bind them together. Time and again, human beings have believed that they finally arrived at a period of enlightenment, only to repeat then cycles of conflict and suffering. Perhaps that's our fate. We have to remember that the choices of individual human beings led to repeated world war. But we also have to remember that the choices of individual human beings created a United Nations so that a war like that would never happen again.
You should know that spy is a criminal. To be a spy is very bad. And your case is death completely, sentence. This is, I must make it absolutely clear. If I found anybody is a spy, and any spy is found and anybody is coming in this cover, see, I want you to see that everybody must be checked his poll tax for about 3 or 5 years. And if he's found to be spy, his case is firing squad. He must be handed straight to military police, must be dealt with the military tribunal, because the case of spying is very serious. Anybody found is a spy, his case must be dealt with military tribunals. Once it's confirmed, even military tribunals should not waste time of making whole day discussing about one person who is the spy. Must be shortcut.
For we have shown that we can choose a better history. Sitting in a prison cell, a young Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that human progress never rolls on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And during the course of these 8 years, as I've traveled to many of your nations, I have seen that spirit in our young people who are more educated and more tolerant and more inclusive and more diverse and more creative than our generation, who are more empathetic and compassionate towards their fellow human beings than previous generations. And yes, some of that comes with the idealism of youth, but it also comes with young people's access to information about other peoples and places. An understanding unique in human history, that their future is bound with the fates of other human beings on the other side of the world. I think of the thousands of healthcare workers from around the world who volunteered to fight Ebola. I remember the young entrepreneurs I met who are now starting new businesses in Cuba. The parliamentarians who used to be, just a few years ago, political prisoners in Myanmar. I think of the girls who have braved taunts or violence just to go to school in Afghanistan. And the university students who started programs online to reject the extremism of organizations like ISIL. I draw strength from the young Americans, entrepreneurs, activists, soldiers, new citizens who are remaking our nation once again, who are unconstrained by old habits and old conventions and unencumbered by what is, but are instead ready to seize what ought to be. My own family is made up of the flesh and blood and traditions and cultures and faiths from a lot of different parts of the world. Just as America has been built by immigrants from every shore. And in my own life, in this country, and as president, I have learned that our identities do not have to be defined by putting someone else down, but can be enhanced by lifting somebody else up. That they don't have to be defined in opposition to others, but rather by a belief in liberty and equality and justice and fairness. And the embrace of these principles as universal doesn't weaken my particular pride, my particular love for America. It strengthens it. My belief that these ideals apply everywhere doesn't lessen my commitment to help those who look like me or pray as I do or pledge allegiance to my flag. But my faith in those principles does force me to expand my moral imagination and to recognize that I can best serve my own people. I can best look after my own daughters by making sure that my actions seek what is right for all people and all children and your daughters and your sons. This is what I believe, that all of us can be co-workers with God. And our leadership and our governments and this United Nations should reflect this irreducible truth. Thank you very much.
Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our our burden and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. The battle will be over. 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 Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. The battle will be over. 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 The battle will be over.